So we have tested a simple standalone piece of functionality like this. We've tested out something with dependencies, but now let's say we want to test this as well. This is my repository layer. This is where I do database interaction, which means if we take a look at the internals of this class, there has to be some database running. So we see here there's this connection string, username and password. And this means that I need a database running somewhere. And in my case, this is actually a MariaDB instance. And if we take a look at the code that I use to generate these JOOQ classes, it's actually a database known as testdb. It ran on my local host. I'm running all of this in Docker, by the way, which brings me to the next point. We're going to make use of a technology or a library known as Testcontainers. I will need a dependency for that. So add this here. It's going to be an org testcontainers and then testcontainers. And we have the version here. All of this stuff is available on Maven Central. Just make sure that you get the correct artifacts there. This testcontainers makes use of our Docker environment running on the machine itself. So that has some implications for a build machine or these unit tests. If you're using these test containers, that means you need Docker running on the machine where maybe your build pipelines are running, because you'll be running those tests as part of the build pipeline on that machine. And that means we need Docker installed there. I have Docker here, so that's not a problem. Let's see here. I'm going to test the repository layer. So I'll have auto testing repository here. And I'm simply going to test the account repository. I'll start off with my test annotation. Void test. Let's see, what are we going to test? I'd like to see that I can create an account. That's the service layer. I'd like to create an account, and then I'm going to read all of those accounts to make sure that this one that I created is in fact inserted into a database somewhere. So test create and read all. So let's see here. I have my account repository system under test. This is my new account repository, and I see here I need a connection string, a username and password. Let me grab the Docker Compose file for MariaDB that I have running currently. So here I have a couple of Docker images or Compose files, and this is what I'm currently running. So I have my image name here, and then there's some environment variables and a port. This is the most important information. I'm not concerned with this add miner at the moment, but just a quick note, when we do the port mapping, we say that the container itself, the application in there, runs on port 8080. So if this thing were running on my machine on its own, I'd hit port 8080 and that will respond with this information, or that'll communicate with this application. But with Docker, I'm saying map the port on my host 6060 to the port 8080 on the container, or the application running in the container. So when I hit 6060, it'll redirect the traffic there. So that's an important point here. There's mapping of ports. I have my Docker Compose file, so that makes the next thing a lot easier. Back to our unit test, we need a connection string, a username and password. From my Compose file, I'm actually just going to put an empty thing there for now. I have the root user in my Compose file, and then the password was this. The last thing we need is this connection string, but now I need a container running. One thing to note here is that spinning up a container is pretty expensive, so we'd like to keep this to a minimum. And in that case, I'm going to have a private static, so only one of these things for this class, a generic container. And this is coming from this test containers dependency. It does take in some generic arguments, so I'll just put this question mark there, and then I'll call this my MariaDB container here. Now we have two more annotations with this JUnit Jupyter. The first one is before all, and this will run some code before any of these test methods are executed. It actually runs before the test class is instantiated, so this thing needs to be static. So we have a public static void. I'll just call this init, and then if we have before all, that also means that we have some sort of after all or the opposite of that. And this is a cleanup. So it's also a static method. I'll call this cleanup. And now in this method, we're going to set up this container here. So I'll say MariaDB is going to be a new generic container. It takes in a Docker image name. And I see that there's a specific type for it. There's also a string variant. So we can pass in the image name as it's defined in our compose file. It's important to keep these versions aligned. We have this with env and with exposed ports and then a whole bunch of other stuff. Waiting for is also a nice thing in here. But in my case, I'm concerned with this environment variable. The first one is going to be the MariaDB root password, which I'll just say secret123. It needs to correspond with whatever we pass in here. But it actually doesn't matter if I make this ASD. I just need to make sure that's ASD as well. This will work. The next one we need is with env. I have this MariaDB database. This is the initial database that will be created when the container starts up. And I'll call this testDB. That's fine. The next thing I need is exposed ports. And I simply give it the port that needs to be exposed on the application inside the container. Now, this is going to map it to some arbitrary port on our machine. And that's it. If I take a look at the compose file again, this is all of the information that needs to be set up for this specific service or this specific container. The next thing we need to do is start this service or this container. And whenever there's a start method on any kind of object, that means that there's also a stop method. And I'll call that in my cleanup in here. This is pretty important because if you don't do this, you might end up with a situation where you have a bunch of running containers that aren't being used. Or every time this test runs, there's new containers being made. I'll just be sure to call stop anyways. That's not all though. We still need to worry about this connection string. So I'll actually make another private static string value. I'll call this my connection string. Then I'll set it up in here. Now a MariaDB connection string, let's see here, it looks something like this. So I'm going to copy this and then I'll say string.format. I'll paste this in here and then I need to replace some of this stuff. So the testDB is fine here. We've specified this as the initial database. The host might need to change because it's running on some container somewhere. I'll just be sure to change that out. And then also the mapped port. We won't be talking to this thing on port 3306 because if we do that, it's going to try and hit the local machine on port 3306 and there's nothing running there. In this case, we can ask the container MariaDB, give me the host, and then it'll take this and put it in our host section here, the variable. And then the final thing, the port that we need is going to be ask the container to get the mapped port. So get the mapped port, the port on our host machine that has been mapped to 3306. And that's it for our connection string. I can actually put this in here. And now that should do the trick. This will make our application connect to some database running. But if we take a look at this SQL script here, there are some tables required. Now, this doesn't take care of creating those tables. Those tables aren't in there yet. If I run any unit test, it's going to tell me that table so-and-so doesn't exist. And we can do that within our init method here. With JOOQ, it's pretty easy. I'll start off with a DSL context or a closable DSL context. This is coming from JOOQ. I'll call this my CTX, and then I'll quickly set this up. So the URL is going to be this connection string that we made. The username, we have this as root and ASD as the password. This needs to correspond. And then we can simply say ctx.create table. I'm testing the account table, so I don't need to worry about any other table. There's this tables generated object in here. So if we take a look at where this is, going to be in this DB package. All of these classes were generated by JOOQ. And if you're interested in seeing how that works, it's going to be this generate JOOQ classes. This is the code that I used to generate these things. So we can tell this tables, give me this account table. I'll take that one, tables.account. Then we need to specify the columns. This is simple This is simply going to be a count.fields. Give me all of the fields. And then finally, I'll execute this call. This will create these tables within this container that's running. Okay, now that we have our SUT set up, this should do the trick. We can tell the SUT to create an account. All right, here I have my my unit test. I do see here that I have the auto closable on this account repository. So that means I should actually just wrap this in a try with resources block. And there we go. So if we run this test, let's see here, it's going to take a lot longer than a normal one. So I'm just going to wait till it finishes. All right, it's done. It had to spin up a new container. That's what took so long. And if you don't have this image on your machine yet, this will take even longer when it needs to pull this image from Docker Hub. But now that our test is running, here it is, it passed. And we can actually see this in action. So if I do a Docker PS here, there are no containers running currently. But if I start this test, let me put a breakpoint in here and I debug this. So what will happen is it will run through all of this code, set up the container, start it up, and then pause my execution on this breakpoint, which means I should be able to open up this terminal again, say Docker PS, and now we see here we have two containers running. The first one is this Ryuk container, Testcontainers Ryuk, and then we have our MariaDB running as well. We can see here that it mapped 32,000 to this port 3306. So that kind of verifies that this test container is making use of my local Docker installation. This test is a lot heavier than the previous test that we covered. It's pretty useful. We can use test containers for all kinds of dependencies. Everything from Elasticsearch to ActiveMQ, anything that requires external software to run for these classes to function. So that's it for test containers. Most important thing was the setup. So let's take a look at a summary. We have this generic container type here. And if we have a Docker Compose file handy, then it's actually very simple to set up this container. We just need to copy over the structure, all of these environment variables, and that's it. Then we need to start it. If you don't start it, then none of these will work. And we can ask it to give me the host name and also any ports that were mapped. So that's very useful, especially in something like in a case like this. You'll probably always get a mapped port. Elasticsearch, ActiveMQ, they all work over ports. And then finally, we need to do some cleanup. So that was it for test containers.